Okay, good afternoon all. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this next instalment of the Coffee Science Seminar. Geoffrey, next slide, thanks. And today we're going to hear from Dr. Geoffry Fordyce on the intriguing topic of test tubes to farming practice. So next slide, thanks, Geoffrey. So I'm Ben Hayes. I head up the Centre for Animal Science here at Coffee. And I'd like to start off by doing an acknowledgement of country. So next slide, thanks, Geoffrey. So I acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of the traditional owners, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue their cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to both Australian and global society. So just before we launch into the seminar, a couple of housekeeping things to mention. The seminar runs from 12 to 1 p.m. And at the end of Geoffrey's seminar, we're going to have a Q&A session. If you have questions, can you please type them into the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen? So don't use the chat button, use the Q&A button. And that's how we'll get questions to Geoffrey. So as I mentioned, our seminar today is from Dr. Geoffry Fordyce. It's my great pleasure to introduce him. He's a senior research fellow here at Coffee, and he has a more than 40-year career in reproduction of beef cattle, both on the bull side and on the female side. And Geoffrey's had quite the impact on the Australian beef industry, particularly the northern beef industry, introducing innovations such as bull sperm testing, heifer scanning and assessment of heifer reproductive performance. And he's also introduced these innovations to other countries such as East Timor, as he'll describe in his seminar. And Geoffrey's going to talk about today I guess it's a new paradigm for how we undertake our research so that it can have a greater impact. And without further ado, Geoffrey, I think I might hand it over to you. So away you go.
Thanks, Ben. Hopefully everyone can hear me out there. Good afternoon. It is afternoon. So what I'm going to do is introduce this by talking about what's actually happening in our beef industry these days. Interesting thing is that we all do research in the expectation that somewhere along the line it's going to have some impact on farming practice. But funnily enough, many of us have had the experience of going to all that effort and doing amazing things and nothing happens. Stays in the cupboard. And the CEO of Meat and Livestock Australia a year or two ago made the statement, which is quite factual, that over 80% of research that agency has funded still awaits industry impact. So they've gone to all this trouble to fund this research, and there is, even if it's very good research, it's not being adopted in industry. So that's a problem. When we look at research to practice change in the industry, for beef, it's around about 20 years. That's just amazing. But even in the medical industry with high priority research, their lag phase is 7 years. So, you know, on average. So there are serious problems and quite large challenges in getting research into industry practice. And it's nowhere near as easy as anyone might think who's not part of the game. So what's happening in the research community itself? What we do, being very special people, is we slip out into the industry, have a bit of a look around, talk to our mates, find a problem. We set up a research question, and then we set about creating a potential solution. So that's fairly useful or fairly standard practice. The funders of research, they're interested in industry problems as well, but sometimes they're not quite so focused on industry problems. They get carried away with correctness of science, and that's very important, but maybe not at the cost of whether it's a problem or not, or an opportunity. And funnily enough, sometimes politics, outright politics, decide what's going to be funded or not funded. So you can see straight away that there's funny things happening right from the beginning. Another interesting thing is that quite often we find ourselves as scientists operating quite independently of industry. So even if we had something to do with industry in creating the research, we set it all up, and then we set about our research, and we may or may not have any industry involvement at all in what we're doing. When we finished our research, we've done something pretty amazing, and we tell the world about it, and still nothing happens. We may have done a fantastic job, but there's no impact. So what's happening at the industry level? By the way, all these photos, they're part of what I do. So if you're sort of wondering what sort of games I play every day, well, this is the industry I live in. So it's a bit of a snapshot as I go through. But what's happening in the industry? The industries that I've worked with, most of the time, most of the people in the industry do not know what is actually going on in research. Very few do. The only thing they experience most of the time is that awareness of someone has finished something or may be doing something, and they hear something on the radio, read about it in the paper. They don't see much of research. They don't have the contact with it. There's no clear pathway to science source solution. So if they've got a question, quite often it's quite tricky for them to track through to a solution, and there's no structured way of doing that in many cases. And a real interesting problem is that industry, they're running businesses and they have their own questions about what they do. And we do research, which is a very, very different game, and we have our questions. And quite often they do not match. They don't match at all in a lot of cases. And when they don't match, if industry questions don't match the scientist questions, well, we're quite simply not answering their questions. That's a major problem. So we've got a situation where industry and research are too often operating independently, and we're just not communicating as well as we should. Another problem is that we keep saying RD&E, which is research, development, and adoption, but we tend to do research, slip out and do some awareness, but we don't do the D. So it's no wonder that there's very little adoption, because D means development. How does our research outcome, if you apply it not just as a component activity, but as part of a system, what are the knock-on effects right through the system of what we're doing? What is the impact on the finances of the business? What is the impact on the welfare of the animals, the people, the environment of what we're doing? Has that been done? Because until that is done, the D is done, it is very difficult for businesses to say, well, I want to do that or I don't want to do that as part of my system. We have this standard scientist practice of producing solutions to what we perceive as problems, and then slipping on down to the farm and trying to patch them into a business that may not even recognise the problem. So they haven't got a need, and we're trying to patch this solution in. And quite simply, that's what I would see as a band-aid approach for perceived problems at the research end, and virtually ignores the problems and the needs of the industry. So, I'm not saying this happens in all cases, because there are plenty of people who do it very well, but there, as the MLA CEO said, there's a hell of a lot of this problem going on. So what if business wants to change practice, what is really happening? This is one of our very long in the tooth, experienced advisors on the left and a cowcocky on the right. And what's got to happen is the bloke on the right, if he's going to change his business practice, essentially, he's got to change his behaviour. And he doesn't change his behaviour unless he has the capacity to do that. So the key word here is capacity. Increased capacity automatically initiates better practice. So if we have people that can do things better, they quite often will do things better. So if we're doing research and we want adoption of those research outcomes adopted in practice, we have to focus on the strategy to develop capacity in our target industries. We can't rely on osmosis. It's not efficacious. Even when sent out with amazing communications glitz, osmosis will not work. So how do we set about capacity development? We want our research having impact, so we have to be involved in capacity development. So a key component of developing capacity of business operators is communication. But unfortunately, most rely on just communications. You can see two words there, they almost look the same, but they're separated by one S, but they're actually very different. So here we are out in the Barkly tablelands, doing a bit of communicating, a few cowcockies and a few scientists. What we're doing is sharing, receiving, and interpretation of messages. Everyone is involved in the process. And the result of good communication is increased capacity of all involved. So it's not just about researchers advising an industry about what their outcomes are and then leaving it at that. The research community has to actually learn as well. They have to learn what the farmers are doing. And there needs to be facilitators as part of the process if it's going to work efficiently. Everyone's capacity has to develop as part of communicating in general terms, but in particularly when we're trying to transfer knowledge from one group to another. And when we're doing good communication, the knowledge transfer is always. When we're doing communications, that's with the S, that's the means by which those messages get shared. And the main purpose is awareness. It's very important, one part of, an initial part of the process, but it's just one small aspect of the whole show. It's not communication, it's just simply awareness. And unfortunately, just telling someone about something doesn't change their practice because it doesn't develop their capacity. It's a bit like learning to ride a horse by watching a video. Can't do it. So you haven't developed capacity. So what's the solution? Well, the first step is do the D. As I said before, when you do research, it doesn't stop at the point when you've finished your experiment and written a scientific paper. If you want that research to have any impact in the industry, you have to understand how your research outcomes will affect the business, how it affects the financial outcomes, how it affects the welfare of the people, the environment, and the animals. Do the D. Become involved in D before you expect any adoption of research outcomes. The second thing that needs to happen is you need to shift from what we call product push to demand pull. So if you're flogging a product, which is the outcome of your research, you can talk all day, but if someone doesn't need it, well, they're not going to do it. It's a bit like selling some terrible toothpaste that doesn't taste good. You can talk all you like, but no one's going to use it. Put that against demand pull. So if someone comes to you, if you're selling toothpaste and says, I really want some of that toothpaste, and in our case it's, well, I really want your research and want to apply it in our situation. How can that happen? So there's a demand pull versus product push. So in a current activity that we're involved in, one of the team put together this very nice little picture of what happens. So the top line is what currently happens. If not for most situations, where you have researchers who do something and hoping the extension people, who are the facilitators, can tell the producers about it, and that, you know, may create practice change. And unfortunately, that's not very efficacious. Whereas the bottom line is a producer-led approach, where the producers are looking at their own situation and saying, well, this is what I need. They go to the extension people, and then those extension people field what research is available to help answer the solutions of the producer. And that is what we call demand pull. The next thing we need to do is be very careful about our language. You know, unfortunately, we're very good at double meaning talk. Say, for instance, in the beef industry, we use words like weaning rate. And when you use words like that, not everyone necessarily understands what you mean. Let me rephrase it like this. So if you have an idea, you build a picture in your head. You've got a picture in your head. You use words to describe that. Someone else hears it. From what they hear, they build a picture in their head. So if the picture in your head and their head is different, your communication's failed. So you need to be very careful about what you say and how you say it, so that you build the picture in the person you're communicating with. The picture in their head is the same as the picture in your head. That's quite a challenge, and particularly if you're not from the same cultural situation, that can be incredibly demanding. But unless you do that, you're not actually communicating. And one of the very important aspects of this is that there is a thing called, or science called communication science. And when we facilitate the process of communication, facilitators need to be trained in and understand communication science, so they help people communicate correctly, get the language right, set it up so it's demand pull, make sure that the D is done. And when we do all of this, there's increased capacity of everyone involved. So if you get involved in the language, the only way you can learn the language is get involved in the industry, speak the language. So I'm going to give you several examples here now of experiences that I've had over many years of taking research to business practice. There was, back in, crikey, it was around about 1992, we recognised there was a major problem, a group of scientists, a couple of producers involved, but it was mainly scientists, that there was a major problem with bulls and their selection and use in North Australia. So during the 1990s, we got together as a team and got some money from a research funder, in this case, Meat and Livestock Australia, and conducted what's turned out to be probably one of the most amazing bull projects that's ever been done in the world, really. And it's a landmark project that really understood what happens under natural mating situations in beef herds. We got on our back legs and told everyone up on boxes and in the newspaper and at field days, and told everyone how amazing it was. Crikey, and then 10 years later, well, not, 5 or 10 years later, there was no change. We still had 20 to 25% of bulls were duds. So people would go to the sale and buy a bull and think they've got a special bull and take it home and mate it and not even realise it was getting no calves. Let alone even, very few would have any idea whether it was getting calves or not. But the science was, now we know, it was showing that so many bulls were duds. Like buying a car that looked nice and flash and having no engine in it. So what happened when we realised that there was no solution is that the cattle vets in Australia were aware that there was a real problem with bull testing or a selection and management of bulls in Australia. And they were aware that we had conducted all of this research and that it was potentially very valuable, but how do we integrate it into current practice? There was no true D done. So the demand was for a national meeting of cattle vets to review all the information, the scientific information that was available, and all the information, not just from what we had done, but international research, what was around. And from this meeting, which was held in Darwin in 2002, a whole series of standards were created. Now, it didn't, in some cases, it didn't change some excellent processes that were used before, but it changed the way in which it was conducted so that it was set out to answer the needs of the industry rather than coming at it from a purely scientific point of view, saying, you know, this is, or so that the producer had an answer to the questions that they had, like, is this bull okay to mate or is he not okay to mate? And associated with that was a process of training and to this day, accreditation of vets. So that, you know, when you go to vet school, you come out with a ticket to say, and a registration to say you can operate, but it doesn't mean to say you're good at everything. And to make sure that we could sustain the standards within veterinary practice, there are a number of practices where veterinarians have to undergo accreditation. It's a bit like specialisation in medicine. And what's happened as a result of that is that there was almost no bull testing going on. But suddenly vets found that because they were able to answer the questions or meet the needs of farmers, vets experienced practice change. They and farmers experienced practice change. The questions being answered were being answered, and the vets started doing a hell of a lot of bull testing that had never ever been done before. And we have seen an exponential rise in bull evaluations. And it's now got to the point, whereas 20 years ago, if you went to a sale, almost no bulls had been tested to see whether they were duds or not. Now you would rarely go to a sale where you would see a bull that's not been evaluated to some degree using the standards that we set up all those years ago. So there was a very good example of, we created a demand pool, we reviewed the situation, we made sure we understood the language, made sure we understood what the farmers needed, and then we worked with them to create the solutions. The next example I'll give you is a good experience I had in Indonesia, and I've been working in Indonesia for many years with smallholder farmers. And this particular photo is from a village that we worked in Lombok, which is to the east of Bali. Prior to our engagement in this process in around about 2000, in the previous 20 years, there've been all sorts of research, but very little practice change. So farmers were still doing what they always did, irrespective of all the research that was going on around them, irrespective as well of whether the research was good or not. There was just no communication or valuable or useful communication of what was available. One of the things was happening in that situation is that there were reducing numbers of bulls available for slaughter. And the authorities in Indonesia were blaming this on genetic regression. So they were saying these Bali cattle, which are a different species to what we're used to in Australia, they were getting worser and worser. They just weren't the same as what they used to be. And they said it was all about genetics. So their solution was to start doing artificial insemination with exotic semen. So they were buying bucketfuls of semen from breeds like Brahman and Simmental, Charolais, and crossbreeding these animals. So they'd end up with very large animals, but not that many of them, and pregnancy rates were very low, and fundamentally it was not effective. So a group of people were invited in, Professor Dennis Poppies, who's in this photograph on the right, and Professor Dalanudden on there as well. He's from the University of Mataram in Lombok. Myself and another guy called Tanda Penjaitan from Lombok. And we reviewed the situation, and we very quickly realised there was no genetic regression. The problems were associated with poor nutrition initially, and then this artificial breeding, which is, you know, they thought it was the solution, but it was actually a serious problem. So what we did then is we went around to quite a lot of villages in Lombok and said, well, what is your problem? What are your needs? And try to understand their systems. And through that, developed a very simple system that may answer their questions. And it revolved around, instead of using artificial breeding, using a bull for natural mating. And you can see this, this pen here where the bull is kept, and the farmer, when the cow comes on heat, he just puts, or he or she just puts the cow in there, and the bull does what he needs to do in about 5 seconds, and you take the cow out and away you go. We started weaning. They'd never weaned before, which there were some religious problems, but once they were explained, it was all good. And then we went to targeted supplementation as well. And we had some villages that were very keen to test this based on their needs and whether, and these potential solutions, would it work? So we spent a couple of years doing this, and one of the outcomes was that farmers' net income doubled. So if you can imagine, you know, our farmer here, if they make $50,000 in a year and you did help them make $100,000, they'd be pretty happy. And that's exactly what happened in this situation. They were seriously happy. And it resulted in widespread facilitated uptake of strategies and research that had been done in the situation, but it was never getting past the point of research. But simply putting it in a system and doing the D and testing the potential solution to farmers' needs, there was widespread facilitated uptake. But funnily enough, some of the local government groups thought, oh, crikey, this is working well, we'll facilitate this program by providing donations. And every time they did it, they reversed the situation. So the farmers said, crikey, why are we going to continue to do all this hard work when the government's just going to give us the money? We'll just stop doing it. And in fact, in the very village where we started all this, the whole show collapsed because the government came in with handouts and it caused the farmers to terminate their vastly improved practices. But irrespective, we had more wins and losses, and to this day, the growth of that integrated village management system has continued, and it's quite huge across Indonesia these days. So that's a good example of going back to basics, understanding the language, understanding the problems, making sure the questions being asked by the industry were those being asked in research, and working together in doing the development, and making sure that everything would ultimately end up in improved financial outcomes. Another example is one that's just nearing completion. This is in Timor-Leste, which is a very small nation, island nation to about 450 k's northwest of Darwin. This is a typical village situation. It's a village called Kasa in southern Timor-Leste. And these are, again, these barley cattle, the Bos Sondaikas. And in their situation, they're not controlled like they are in Indonesia. Essentially, they have subsistence farmers who live in typical situations like you can see in the background there. They have pigs and cattle and sheep and horses and goats and pigs and whatever, and they just roam around scavenging whatever they can, and the farmers have these animals. And what they do with these animals, they don't actually eat them. They are, some of the smaller animals they do eat, but many of them they just, that is their bank. So they don't have access to banks as we know it. So if they want some money for education purposes or need some an operation, surgical operation, or need to buy a motorbike or something like that, they sell the cow. And so the cow is a bank, and it's extremely valuable, and there's no husbandry at all in these traditional situations. And the other problem that poor people have is that when they go to sell these things, they don't know much about marketing, and they're between a rock and a hard place, and whoever they sell them to, instead of getting you know, $700, they might get $350. So it's a very disadvantageous position they're in. The government recognises this, but their programs, that every time they try to impose them, they fail, continually fail, because they didn't really look at the problems that the farmers had. They just sort of look at their solution to what they perceived were the problems. They try to change practice by changing just one part of a business and not a whole business. And as soon as they walk away, the whole thing would fall over every time. But the government did recognise that there was a big opportunity, because the oil money was running out and they needed industries like cattle to create the cash flow that was needed to to take the country forward in the future, in the absence of oil. So this is where a research team based at the University of Queensland was brought in to help. So the first thing we did was conduct what we called a situation analysis. So just as in Lombok, we looked at the population of animals, we looked at what feed resources were available, and in Timor-Leste it was extraordinarily poor, because you know, instead for every you know, there's just huge overstocking in the country. How the animals perform, what sort of productivity there is, what sort of markets there were available, and actually the markets were very, very good, just that they weren't being taken advantage of. And what is the capacity of the people? And this was the fundamental issue, is that the capacity of the people was very, very low. And even in the R&D and the university sector, except with some exceptions, the capacity was well below where it needed to be. So we essentially created, or helped create, a process which I think is quite interesting, and a good example of again how we can take research to farming practice. So if we just look at the central part of this illustration here, you can see it's an orange highlighted. And what the process is that in a small area, a group of farmers and traders would establish what they called a ready commodity. So they got together and said, well, what are we going to call this? So they had ownership. There's ownership by the farmers. They lead it, not the Agri Department, which is called the Ministry for Agriculture and Fisheries, or MAF. They don't lead it. All they do is facilitate. So the farmers own the situation. It's their group. They have their own chief of the group, and they call it a ready commodity. Basically, they get together and say, well, we're raising cattle, but these are our problems, and this is what we think we need. And then through working with the MAF facilitators, who come from the RD&E sector of MAF, they find solutions to their needs, they test those, and then go forward to adopt the practices that suit their particular situations and end up with better livelihoods. Righto, so that's the outcome that we want. But we had to create that in the first place. So to do that, we essentially set it up in a couple of places to work out how it would work in that cultural situation. And the first thing we needed to do was put a group of farmers together and help them work out in that social situation how to keep a group together, how to structure a group, how to work out what their needs were, and how to have the whole process facilitated. And that was done by a group of Indonesians and Australians, and we had fantastic Indonesian partners in this process, fantastic people. And they did communication for development, training and research. The second part that we needed to support them with was the technical aspects, the forage and cattle systems. And so we had a team of Indonesian and Australian scientists who were doing that. And the third thing was the technical aspects of marketing and business. So if you want to go and sell a cow, once you've created one, you don't want to sell it for $400, you want to sell it for $800. And secondly, when you're conducting the business and you're going to do something different, well, straight away your costs increase, and then business skills come in, which is very different in a semi-commercial situation to a subsistence situation. So you have to help people transition through training and involvement in the process that would happen in these ready commodity. The whole process was facilitated by a management team, which you can see out on the right, part of this large ACR project. And the research and the activities progressed for a couple of years, and the objective was to peel away everything from the outside of that, what is illustrated there, to be left with what is highlighted in orange. And we've actually almost got to that point. We're essentially there, and it's worked brilliantly. Because what has happened is that when we've helped farmers in these test situations shift to a semi-commercial system, they have experienced huge increases in family income. And I mean thousands and thousands of dollars that some farmers have, individual families have now been able to increase their annual income by. Now, for a farmer that lives on $5 a day, when you increase his annual income by $2,000, that's huge. And that's the sort of impact that these ready commodity processes have. And the real problem that we have now in Timor-Leste with this process is we cannot keep up with demand. So there are over 400 sukos, or villages, in Timor-Leste, and farmers are really wanting to be part of this, or sukos are wanting to be part of this, but we can only support about 21 of these ready commodity. But now the MAF has the capacity to go out and set them up wherever and whenever they want, and they now have the skills to do it, which is sensational. So the outcome here is very, very successful, and it really came down to starting at the basics, understanding the situation, speaking the language, doing the D, and working with the farmers to actually understand their needs, and then going to seek the research that was available. I'll quickly talk about NB2, which is Northern Beef Business. There are two Bs, and that's why it's NB2, which is a program we're trying to start in North Australia, where it's not totally dissimilar to what I just described for Timor-Leste, but in culturally and financially and all the rest of it, it's very, very different, of course. But fundamentally, there's many similarities. So in our situation, what we do know is that the Australian beef industry is operating well below potential. So for instance, live weight production per beef animal in Australia might be somewhere between 130 and 140 kilograms a year, and we know it can be near 180. So what's going wrong? Why aren't we doing it as well as we should? There's plenty of solutions there, and the scientists think they're all obvious, but they're not being implemented. Just as Jason Strong from MLA said, 80% of what we produce is sitting in the cupboard. And added to this is that, unfortunately, beef producers in many cases are not applying standard business practice. So just the whole, a simple example is stock take each year. Every business in the world does a stock take annually, analyses their situation and works out where they're at and where they're going to, except most beef businesses don't seem to do that. And there's a weak connect between industry perceived needs and R&D outcomes. So there's a real problem out there. And fundamentally, the reason for all of this is we're doing top-down research. So we're creating these solutions and trying to patch them into businesses that don't even see that the problem that we're seeing, they're seeing another problem, or looking at the same problem in a different way. So we've got to find a solution to that. We just can't keep on doing poor practice. So the basic strategy is an industry-led process to facilitate practice change, not led by an agency like Meat and Livestock Australia or government programs, industry-led. This looks pretty complicated, but I'm not going to go through it all, but I just outline a couple of key aspects of this. And the key aspect is that there's a big central rectangle there called Pathway to Practice. And essentially, that is a process just like in Timor-Leste, where groups of farmers would get together and describe their business and understand their problems and their opportunities. What are their needs and what are their questions? And this is led by producers and facilitated by, in a lot of cases, government agents who are trained in facilitation. So the facilitators don't lead this, the groups have their own leadership. Out on the right there is governance, and essentially that is industry people who are overseeing the process. Linked to Pathway to Practice, if there is research going on, either related to herd or the environment or the feed base, if the beef businesses have a need, then there is a structured link back to researchers involved in each of those three areas, and researchers themselves, when they go to do research, have a link with the beef producers involved in Pathways to Practice. So to make sure that they're actually answering industry questions, and when they're doing research, they make the measurements that enable assessment, not just of performance, but of productivity and profitability, and progressing more towards D and not just doing R&D. So that's why you can see it's a big R, big D and a little a, whereas in Pathways to Practice, it's more about little r, little d and a big A. And this process has attracted huge interest by the industry, and they're very, very keen to do it. But the funny thing is that it means everyone has to change the way they do business, particularly RD&E agencies. And that's tough. It's really tough on the funders who think that they were funding, have their system of the way they've been funding things all these years, and suddenly the industry said, no, we're going to do it differently. So change is very tough, and it's slowly evolving for this process to be adopted, where we have an industry-led process so that we don't try and take research to the industry. We set it up so there's demand pull. We're not trying to do product push. The expected outcome of this is increased capacity right across the board. So scientists themselves will become up to their ears in industry practice. And once all of this happens, there'll be much better practice change. So we're scientists, most of us probably listening. What is the sort of action that we need to take to make sure that we increase farming the adoption of farming practices as a result of good research outcomes? The first thing that I strongly recommend is involve industry up front in your research. Set it up for success. Don't set it up for failure. If industry is not involved, that's a setup for failure, particularly if you've had no industry consultation whatsoever. They don't even know what's going on. You can guarantee your question is going to be different to theirs. So involve industry. Even just one beef producer makes a huge difference for beef research. As I said earlier, many scientists are actually already doing this really well, but many are not. Understand industry business, their questions, and interestingly enough, their complex decision making. From someone who doesn't have to manage a business, it might sound incredibly easy. You just do this. Or when you finish ploughing that paddock and you come home at night, just log on the computer and do this for me. Well, there's no such thing as just, because they're so buggered from a day in the paddock that all they want to do is just have a drink of rum. So it's and not only that, they've been thinking all day and they just don't want to think anymore. And when they're thinking, it's very complex. They have to consider so many things because there's only so much time and so many people. It's limited in what they can do. And sometimes they may or may not have the capacity. We have to understand their perceptions and questions. Get involved. Focus on their research questions and make sure that they're linked to a long-term vision of what the industry will be. Get involved in D. Do the D. Don't just do the R, because if you do R and fail to do the D, your research will never go anywhere unless you're lucky. When someone is involved or people are facilitating research that come from you, get involved with the communication process. That way, your research will be well represented. And always remember that practice change in the industry is actually a behaviour change, and behaviour change is not easy. And change is tough to achieve. Righto, thank you very much. I would now like to pull it up there and hand it back over to Ben.
Thanks very much, Geoffrey. Fantastic insights into how you can actually get your research implemented. So we do have a couple of questions that we'll throw to. One is a specific question about I think it was the Indonesian situation. And this person's wondering why the AI didn't actually work. And natural mating was the solution there.
Righto, so the AI had a couple of problems. One is that it was mandated by the government, and when they had to use a government agent to do the AI and had to pay that government agent 5,000 rupiah for each insemination that they did. And there was huge amounts of corruption involved in that process and big backlashes from the farmers on having to pay this, so that whenever they could, they would duck insemination. The second problem was that the insemination practices were very inefficient. Like the farmer would see a cow on heat and then he'd say, send a message to town for the inseminator to turn up to inseminate, which needed to be pretty quick. And sometimes they'd turn up days later with or without semen that was frozen or not frozen, which means live or dead. And you can imagine all the sorts of technical or the sorts of failures that were created. And it just fundamentally wasn't working because it was a really top-down plan for failure.
Yep, thank you. Chendong has a question. Chendong farmers to solve environmental problems or managing land and water. So not so much an animal production.
You're cutting in and out there, Ben. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, Geoffrey. Do you have an example in supporting farmers to solve an environmental problem or managing land and water?
Yeah. So an example was, this happened 40 years ago. We're doing some research on weaning in cattle. Oh, it's giving away my age, isn't it? And this guy had come up with, these researchers had come up with this idea that you just wean twice a year in these continuously mated herds and wean all calves who were 3 months of age and older. And what would happen is if you did that, the number of weaners would increase dramatically. So an extension activity was set up, and this farmer was recruited, of this family, and they applied this practice and it worked brilliantly, and there was a big field day at the end, and old mate got up and said, well, since we've been doing this, we've weaned 1,000 more calves a year from our herd, which was all true. So everyone went away happy. The activity stopped, and the farmer kept on weaning. And then a few years later, what had happened was that he kept doing it, but the number of calves dropped, his bulk numbers or his sale numbers dropped back down to where they were. And he's scratching his head and said, well, I've been doing this, but it's all a failure. And the problem was that he had he had continued that, but in his situation, he was a real old-timer family, and they sold no female cattle. Basically, the cows got too old or whatever, and they died in the paddock. And it was very much a harvesting operation, and you know what happened years ago. And so he never changed. The cows started living because they were weaning, so the stocking rate went up. When the stocking rate went up, the cow condition went down, so therefore they didn't get pregnant, and that's why the number of calves went down, and the turn-off went down as well, or the sale numbers went back down to where they used to be. So the problem was that he never changed the system. He just changed one little part of his practices. So then there was support to help that person change a whole system to help keep the stocking rate or the environmental situation stabilised, to make sure that there was good grass growth and to support. So he then not only started to sell a lot more cattle, started weaning again, but he started to sell a lot more cattle, and his income went up, his pasture production went up, his cow condition went up. So there were great welfare outcomes and animal welfare, great environmental welfare outcomes, and funnily enough, great human welfare outcomes as well.
Yeah, nice example. I like that. We do have half a question from Chris O'Connor, which is, hi, Geoffrey. Chris, do you want to type the rest of your question? I assume you have one. And in the meantime, I'll ask you a question, Geoffrey. I really like your model for producer-initiated or producer-driven research, and it's kind of what we do, not exactly in our group, but pretty close. But how do you think it would have worked, or if you just followed this model, do you think some of the big innovations in the beef industry would have occurred? So, for example, the introduction of Brahman genetics to Northern Australia, would that have happened under this model? Or would people have just been blinded to that opportunity?
Well, funnily enough, that some of those innovations, the industry actually did it, not scientists, Ben. So I think the model stands very strongly, because whether the innovation comes from researchers or the ideas from the industry, it needs to come back to answering an industry need. So in the case of the transition to Brahmans back in the 60s and 70s, there was a major problem with performance and productivity of those cattle at that time. And a number of producers said, well, we can fix this by introducing Brahman. There was huge backlash and all the rest of it, but they took it upon themselves to do this. But at the same time, there was researchers involved who were helping them test various questions that the industry had. So essentially, research was working together with the industry to solve the problems. Researchers didn't come up with the idea. The actual idea came from the industry in the first place, but when they worked together with the industry, essentially using that model, that was the outcome. But at the same time, that, you know, all the innovations that have come around in genetics and genomics these days, if they're linked to industry questions and needs, I think that they're being very, very successful. If they're being done in a test tube by a group of people that don't have an industry need, I think it's much more difficult then to get linkage and adoption of what they get back to industry, because they're not actually working with industry in some of those situations to answer their specific questions.
Yep. Good. We've got a question from Elizabeth Ross. She says, great talk. And then her question is, what is the biggest northern beef issue that we should be working on at QAFI, but we are not currently working on?
Probably the biggest issue that we have in the North Australian beef industry is managing of our feed base. And in QAFI, our task is not, we're not in the balance of who's responsible for that. We're not actually tasked with researching the feed base for cattle, but certainly we're tasked with with looking at the utilisation of the feed base, which has big impacts on which when I say utilisation, I mean the feed base is there, turning that available feed into live weight, which is then available to sell. So the task that we have is improving fertility, improving growth, and improving survival. And funnily enough, the biggest gains that have been made over the last 30 or 40 years, and still the biggest gains to be made, are in survival. Most of our attention has been to growth and fertility. Survival has been a secondary beneficiary of that, but the fundamental benefits really have come from survival. And that's a bit of an eye-opener that many people might not be aware of, is the impacts of innovations and changes in our industry, whether they come from research or the industry itself, has been on survival.
Yep. Of your comment really down below and ground, this is great to see.
You're cutting in and out, Ben.
Yeah, sorry, Geoffrey. I think the internet here is not so great, right in the heart of St. Lucia, but anyway. We have another question. You have mentioned a lot regarding communication. Is there any IP protection for the research outcome before introducing it to the industry? So I guess, what's your attitude to IP protection, Geoffrey, before getting the outcomes to the industry?
Yeah, an interesting question. In the past, we haven't, in a lot of the areas that I've been involved in, we haven't been that concerned about IP, but increasingly we do, because the most important IP is the original data, not the analysis of that data. So increasingly we are seeing some emphasis put on applying IP to raw data. And I applaud that, because with the development of smart systems now, data is a saleable item, whereas it didn't used to be. And that is probably the one area where we need to be very careful about what we do. Otherwise, we do all the work and someone else gets it for nothing. One mob pays for it and another mob gets it for nothing, which is a bit unfair. I mean, I think groups that do the research and develop the data should get some payback for that too, so that those who benefit from it can share the cost of it.
Yep, interesting. And I think that's probably the way things have to go. We have a question from Lewis. Geoffrey, most researchers are not necessarily involved in changing the industry. What is your opinion on how to promote?
No, mate, I didn't get the question. You just cut out it when you got to the question.
We need the fundament.
No,
so
I never heard a thing then, mate.
Researchers.
I'm not hearing anything. Sorry.
Okay, I'll try once more, Geoffrey.
Righto.
What is your opinion on how to promote more development? So more around how do we get researchers more involved in D rather than just R?
Righto. That's a good question, Lewis. I think it's a two-way task, and it's not easy. Researchers need, I think, to actively try to engage with the industry, and D will happen because of that. You know, they've got some research and they want to make it happen. And at the same time, industry needs to be asking some questions, but the only time that they're going to ask the questions that we can answer a lot of the time is when we're engaged with them. So I think the first step is just simply finding a way to get together, attend field days, attend and become active in those processes, attend meetings with farmers, go and spend some days with farmers wherever they're happening, and then work with them on ideas. And from those partnerships, then projects come from that, D comes from that. But you really got to start communicating at a basic level before you can build the ideas and the projects that happen. It all comes from personal relationships a lot of the time.
Yep, couldn't agree more. We've got a question from Anonymous. Any suggestions for a better uptake of estimated breeding values in Northern Australia? So for the people that don't know what estimated breeding values are, they're estimates of genetic merit of animals for selection. So away you go, Geoffrey.
Wow. So for those who aren't aware, EBVs, or genetic merit measures of cattle, come with bulls. So some bulls are sold, they say they're good for growth, or they're bad for, they're average for growth or whatever. And there is this label on the animal. But in the Northern Australian, particularly in the Northern Forest region, there's not much notice taken that. Increasingly, farmers are looking at the EBVs in their purchase of bulls. Now, fundamentally, the reason why a lot of this happens, in my opinion, is that the farmers are not necessarily describing their businesses for themselves sufficiently to know what they actually need. So if they don't know that they need that, well, they're not going to go looking for it. Whereas if they analyse their business critically and said, well, I've got a specific problem with fertility, therefore I'm going to go looking for bulls and I don't know what to do about it. I've got these management solutions, but I also need a genetic solution, and that what are the genetic solutions, and go looking for it and end up finding a days to calving EBV or a scrotal circumference EBV. Until they describe the businesses that aren't interested, until they describe their own businesses and their own needs more formally and in an objective way, they're not going to go looking for it. And the businesses that aren't are just not, in general terms, using more analytical business methods. They're using very laid-back business methods, and they can get away with it because they're making a lot of money, and while they're making money, they're not going to change.
Yep, some interesting observations there on the kind of training we need for the future, I think. I'm going to have to pull it up there because we're running out of time, or actually run out of time. But I'd just like to read out Arla's comment, and her comment is, I think the biggest problem for the northern beef industry is that Geoffrey is planning to retire soon. So we'll leave it there, I think.